Amen and amen. Back in Genesis 7, as we introduce the global catastrophe, the worldwide flood. So last week we saw how God had told Noah that he was going to send the flood. Good morning, Jamie. We had saw how Noah had labored faithfully to build the ark. We talked about that probably took decades to construct. We saw that 7 days, so God had been silent that entire time, and then 7 days before God is going to let it happen, he communicates to Noah again, board the ark, load the animals that I'm going to send to you, because in 7 days I'm going to send 40 days of rain and destroy everything. You can imagine Noah, who was a preacher of righteousness, the seriousness, the depth of his preaching got real profound. He was urging people to board God's ark, God's rescue mission for their day to escape judgment. And yet the only ones who took him up on that offer were his 3 sons, his wife, and their wives. Normally, I spend time sort of reviewing what we covered last week to set us up for this week. But this week, I want to go back a little further than last week to cover some things we covered, back on week 2. So like 12 weeks ago, and I want to take us back to the first 3 days of creation. I want us to see afresh some things that I said then that would come up later. It's now time for those things to come back around. Beginning in Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning, the first yom, the first day. We talked about that. So on this first day, God has created matter. We have a planet. He's created energy. He's created space. And here is this spinning planet in space, in the darkness of space, covered by water. God has not yet created our sun. He's not yet created any other planets or stars. And then in the midst of that darkness, he says, "Let there be light." And our planet, day one, is illuminated with the light of God as it's spinning in space, covered by water. It is a beachless ocean, but that's where we find ourselves at the end of day one. Day 2. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. And let it separate," this expanse, "waters from waters." And God made the expanse, and he called that expanse heaven, that separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called that expanse again heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. Now, this language is really like, I watched Dean's head kind of go. God creates in the midst of the water. Now, the only water we know about is on the face of the planet. The whole planet is covered with water, and God divides the water and creates an expanse that he calls heaven. This is likely our atmosphere. This is likely where the birds fly. If you remember during week 2, I walked you through the 6 pieces of our atmosphere, the 6 divisions of our atmosphere. And here he describes divided the waters with the expanse we call heaven. And it implies that there are waters below, we get that, that's the planet, covered by water, and there are waters above this expanse. Now that's not me, that's just what that seems to say. Now, as you sort of wrestle with that, we understand this is when God made our atmosphere, we get that, but I do want you to consider a couple other things. Josephus was of Jewish priestly descent. He fought against the Romans until he surrendered in 67 AD with his forces in Galilee. He's best known, though, for writing history, both Roman and Jewish history. In particular, his writings, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. In Antiquities of the Jews, book 1, chapter 1, as he's talking about creation, Josephus says this: "After this, on the second day, he," that's Yahweh, that's God, that's Elohim, he placed the heaven over the whole world and separated it from the other parts. And he determined that it should stand by itself, and he placed a crystalline firmament around it. Now, Josephus is not scripture. He probably represents, though, Jewish thought at that time. And he seems to understand that what God did on day 2 was put a crystalline structure around the earth. This is why this verse in Genesis, as well as one in Psalms and what Josephus says here, is why many theologians believe there may have been, keyword may, possibly, may, a water, ice, or vapor canopy that was wrapped around this planet. This might help explain why people were living so long, because it blocked many of the dangerous forms of radiation and cosmic rays that come from our sun. We cannot be sure, but this is where people would get this idea. Now, there's a lot of research has been done down this line. And here's what we know for sure. Dr. Walt Brown, who's done the most research, and by the way, he does not believe in a canopy. Okay, so he doesn't believe in a canopy, but he's done a lot of research, and here's what he's come to. If there was a canopy, and it's possible, water vapor, water, or ice, it could not be any thicker than 40 feet, because the canopy is going to increase pressure here on Earth, and it's going to create a greenhouse effect on the Earth. That becomes a runaway effect once that canopy, through modeling, once it gets about 40 feet thick. So if there was an ice or water vapor canopy, it was relatively thin when you think about water, the ocean, or whatever. For sure, less than 40 feet, because that's when it would start killing things here on Earth, and that would not be the goal. But the question, it does bid the question, did the pre-flood world look something like that? No idea. I will share with you, I shared it with you in week 2. This comes from astronomy.com. By the way, you can get this from nasa.gov. You can get this from any science. Just Google space shuttle upper atmosphere, and you're going to start getting articles about what's going on. Okay, so I'll give you the short of the story. Water vapor comprises 97% of what the space shuttle's engine exhaust is. Space shuttle goes up, a lot of it is steam. It's exhausted into the atmosphere. What they're seeing is as a space shuttle rips through the atmosphere is that water vapor instantly freezes in the upper atmosphere, freezes to ice because it's so cold. It instantly freezes. And it floats up to the poles and begins to float in the mesosphere 51 miles above the Earth as ice, floating ice in our atmosphere. And again, that's not me. That's right from astronomy.com, nasa.gov, wherever you want to go read about it. In fact, scientists start to speculate the long-term impacts. If we continue to shoot things into space, what will happen is more and more of this ice forms up there. So as you wonder, how could ice ever be in the upper atmosphere? It is right now, in fact. Now, this is obviously a small amount, and it would take a massive amount to put an ice barrier 20, 30, or 40 feet. But I do want you to understand, did it once look like that? We cannot be sure, but I would say it is possible. Well, let's get back to our story. So we have a water-covered globe spinning in space. It now has an atmosphere, possibly a canopy, but it is still a beachless ocean of a planet. Let's pick the story back up. God speaks again. Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. Now we're going to go on with the remaining stuff of day 3. The land's going to appear, all that. Let's just stop right here. We have a water-covered globe. Now here's what Rich was expecting to read next. Then God gathered the dirt together, and in gathering the dirt together, you could almost picture the continents rising up out of the water, and the water sinking down, water rushing off these new continents that he's gathered up. That's not what it says. Or maybe God sticks his hand into the water, John, and he sweeps dirt together and forms continents. And you can picture the water brimming off the continents as God does that. That's not what the text says, though. Look what it says. The planet is covered by water, Jack. And God says, I gathered the waters together in one place, and when I did that, dry land appeared. Many theologians, and I'll give you a few other verses on why they think this, believe that at this point what God did is gathered about half of the water that was on the surface of our planet at the time into subterranean caverns under the crust of the earth. In doing that, that caused dry land to appear. Imagine him pulling water off the surface into subterranean caverns below the crust of the earth, somewhere 10 to 50 miles below, into a 3/4 to 1 mile cavernous chamber below the crust of the planet. Now, as you think about that and go, wow, that's crazy. I've never imagined anything like that. Well, let me show you some things that are in the Bible. Psalm 33, verses 6 and 7. By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts. We get that. He gathers the waters of the seas as a heap. He puts the deeps in storehouses. You say, well, that's just poetic language. But it means something. And what does it mean that God put the deep in storehouses? Psalm 136. To him alone who does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who by understanding made the heavens, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now wait a minute. You say, well, Rich, it's just poetry. But doesn't it mean something that he spread out the earth on the water? I'll give you another one. Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he founded it, he foundationed it. I realize that isn't a word. He built its foundation on the sea. This is why many theologians believe that what happened here on day 3 is that God gathered a great portion, some portion of our water that was on the surface, into subterranean chambers under the crust. In doing that, if you could have seen it that day, if you could have been there, you would have seen the water levels going down, giving the effect of dry land coming up, becoming visible. And that's what many theologians believe happened on that 3rd day. Again, 10 to 50 miles below the crust, let's just call it 3/4 of a mile to a mile of cavernous water. Let's see, anything else? So did the pre-flood world look like that? Now, this is not to scale, and Trish has a question. But imagine 10 to 50 miles of crust, and by the way, I couldn't find a good representation of this on the internet, y'all, and I can't develop these things. So this is as close as I found. And a 3/4 of a mile to a mile, and I tried to make interconnected chambers, but it looked goofy, so I just left that alone. But picture it in your mind, is that what it looked like? I'll go one step further. Did it look like that? Did it look like 10 to 50 miles of crust, let's call it a mile of water underneath the crust, and a crystalline water vapor, ice canopy above God's new creation? Is that what it looked like at the end of day 3? I don't know. In fact, I'll sum it up this way. I would summarize there's a possibility there was a canopy, and there's a high probability that there were subterranean waters, because he says it so many times. And then Trish has a question, then we're going to Matt.
Well, actually, for us living in Florida, this is very easy to understand, because look at how many aquifers we have here. And we have all kinds of springs, Icatachi, Brulou Springs, Jenny Springs. So for us to have waters underneath for Florida, this is something with which we are very familiar.
What's the green stuff? Plants, trees.
On day 3?
Yeah, keep in mind, he caused the dry land to appear, and then in rapid growth, all those trees and all. So I didn't read the rest of the verses. I cut it off, Matt. But yeah, that's what happened at day 3. Yeah, Lisa.
Is there any research that these caverns, I would think they might still exist?
So there is, and there's a lot of research. And so what's about to happen is I'm going to get out of sync on my notes and share with you something that's happening. So each week since we started Genesis, Sandy and I will chat about, she'll ask the question, hey, what are we going to be talking about this Sunday? And I will say, we're going to be talking about X, Y, and Z. And then she will say, well, now, if you're going to be talking about X, Y, and Z, you need to mention A and B, because she's been through many of my creation studies. Not Genesis studies. I've never taught through the book of Genesis, but I've done creation studies. And so she's like, you need to do A and B. And I will say, she can vouch for this, I'll make a video about that. I'll load up a paper about that. And she'll say, no, you need to talk about it in Sunday school. I said, no, I'm sticking close to the text. I'll upload a video about distant starlight. I'll upload a video about the supposed evolution of man. I'll upload a video about this. I'll upload a paper about that. I'll upload a discussion about that, but I'm not going to touch it in Sunday school because we're staying close to the text. But here the text is about to deal with something that we had to at least get an idea was in the Bible to begin with. And there's lots of good research that I'm going to start weaving in the next few lessons together for us to see that it's not just the Bible. There's lots of evidence in our world that indicates that this is exactly what it looked like when God created this place. If you had been there on day 3, this is what you would have found. Now, again, don't picture a little teeny, this would have been 10 to 50,000 or 50 miles of crust and then a mile of water, let's say. But imagine, before I get back on my notes, do you have a question? Because I'll get the mic coming. Question over there. Imagine the immense pressure that water would have been under with 10 miles of overlaid granite. I mean, picture if you had a waterbed and it was a really tough waterbed and it had a good height on it, and you and your wife laid on it, the pressure would increase in that waterbed due to your weight. And now you take your truck and you park your truck on that waterbed. The pressure would increase in that waterbed. Now you take a 10-mile column of granite and set it on your waterbed. Assuming the skin could handle it, what would happen? The pressure would be immense. But don't worry, it's all contained. The rock is the upper shell, mantle is the lower shell. It's under control. But Kitty has a question.
I just don't see how a mile cavern can hold all the water. Where does that research come from?
So there's lots of research that's been done. Some of the greatest is Dr. Walt Brown, the hydroplate theory. So if you want to write that down, you can actually get that entire textbook online free of charge in PDF format. The hydroplate theory, Dr. Walt Brown. Now, as you think about when you say all the water, keep in mind when we say a mile of water, that seems like that's not very much water. That's 5,280 feet of water. You see, we say a mile and that seems like, oh, a mile, that's nothing. How about this then? If a mile doesn't seem like the right number, 5,280 feet of water. And that would not have been all the water. That would have been just, as we're estimating, the water that he put in subterranean caverns. He would have left plenty of water on the surface because there were seas at the time. So he didn't take, Kitty, to go to the question, all the water. He took a great deal of the water. Keep in mind the global catastrophe, as we will begin to unravel it today, would have resulted in catastrophic plate tectonics that would have changed the geography, the topography of our planet radically, and would have created the massive high mountain ranges that we see now. They were probably much smaller at creation. Now, I realize I'm just beginning to answer the questions, but don't worry, I have more things planned to be weaved in here in just a second. But that is everything I wanted to say to get us to the introduction. Any questions, Rob?
A mile deep.
Deep.
And 24,000 miles around.
Around the entire planet.
That's a lot of water.
That is an entire ocean that's 5,250 foot deep around the planet. So if you're picturing something small, you're not getting the picture. But you should picture this ocean under immense pressure. And the only thing that's holding it is the sheer strength of the granite. The pressure is not enough to shear the granite apart. That's the only thing keeping this show going. Any questions? What I'm going to do is I'm going to read verses 6 to 10, which is where we ended last week, and then go right into 11. I'll probably make very few comments to get us right to 11, and then 11 I'm going to start the verse-by-verse exposition. Mike's coming. So I'm going to read 6 through 10, hit 11, and we'll start verse-by-verse exposition.
You seem to study this a lot. My question is right now we have at least portion of our core that is liquid. Do we have an estimate on how much pressure is on that so we could get an estimate on what kind of pressure would be on the water based on, now granted the liquid core is it's a thicker density than water, but
You got an inner core and outer core,
yeah,
right? An inner mantle, an outer mantle, and then the crust. So if you're talking about the inner core, it would be immense pressure and immense heat. But you're talking about you're talking about many, many, many miles to get to the core. Okay, so keep in mind, lava generally, as best we understand lava, and we'll talk about, happens through interaction with plates, as plates rub against each other and melt rock. You see, then there are examples where there's cracks, we believe, in the crust that allow that liquid. I do not. Enough to bring it out as lava, which is a very viscous material, not like water at all. So, any questions before, again, verse 6, I'll just start running to 10, and we'll keep heading. Okay. Very few comments. This is where we ended last week. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of the clean animals and of the animals that are not clean, and of the birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with God as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, as God had previously promised, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. God had said, in 6 days I will do, or in 7 days I will do this, and sure enough, we ended with last week that he did. Verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were open. Now, here we're told not only what happened, but when it happened. So let's start with when. We saw the final preparations. We saw the 7 days. We saw that was when, if you go back to the verses, God had said, in 7 days I'm going to send rain on earth, 40 days and 40 nights. Every living thing that I've made, I'm going to blot out from the face of the ground. And then indeed, after 7 days, we just read it, God did it. God warned and God executed. God said and God did. But here, this is that day. This is that 8th day. This is the 600th year, the second month, the 17th day of the month. There's the 7 days of preparation, and there's the day the fountains of the great deep were opened up according to Genesis chapter 7. 600th year of Noah's life, second day of the month, 17th day of that month, day 0 in our timeline. This is the start. This is the genesis of the flood. This is the point in Noah's life when the flood occurred. He was 600 years old, 2 months, 17 days. When we know things like this, it's easy for us to loop this back to our genealogy chart, back to our list of patriarchs, and quickly determine that the flood would have happened around 1,656 years after creation. And Kristen has a question.
So when it says the second month, would this be going off of the traditional like Jewish calendar, or had that not even been made yet?
Great question. Theologians believe that what God is using here is a 30-day calendar. You'll see why soon enough, because we're going to hit day 150, where it lands. So what they believe is that God's marking time in 30-day months. Now, was a Jewish calendar made? No, we have no reason to believe it was made yet. Was Noah superimposing backward the Jewish calendar? Probably he was just passing on what he either received, written, or verbal. But definitely, as we're marking time, 600, 2nd, 17, day 0. As you mark the time of the patriarchs, roughly 1,656 years after the creation. But look at the language. Oh, Sandy has a question.
I was developing that question.
Still developing it? Okay, she's developing a question. I'll be ready when she does. Now, an honest reading of the text here demands that you understand this is a literal event. This is not a parable. This is not a spiritual story. This is not something that you learn a spiritual truth from. God gave the exact day in Noah's life when this happened. This is not some mystical story. This is not a parable. It's on that very day that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The springs of the great deep broke up. The springs of the great deep cleaved open. Those are all other ways we could interpret that. The Basic Bible in English says it this way: all of the underground springs erupted. The Holman Study Bible says, or the Holman Bible says it this way: all the sources of the watery depths burst open. The message says it this way: all the underground springs erupted. What I don't want you to miss is the geophysical implications of this event. That the great deep is bursting forth. Whatever you want that to be, it's got to be something. Now, Pastor will sometimes say, I'm going to use my sanctified imagination. And so I would like you to join me just for a few minutes using your sanctified imagination. That's an imagination, by the way, that's informed by scriptures. We've just read some things about this. And by the way, I'm hoping that I can inform it with a little science. And so, I want you to imagine with me a pre-flood earth. We've already talked about the possibility of water in the ice canopy. We'll leave that alone for a second. Keep in mind, it would have had a smaller amount of water on the surface with a greater amount of water under the crust. It likely had one supercontinent with smaller oceans than we see today. It would have been covered with much more land, which would have resulted in much more vegetation and, again, smaller oceans than we see today. I told you that the estimates are that about half of the water in the oceans today would have existed below the surface in interconnected subterranean chambers of water. The estimate of these subterranean caverns, 3/4 of a mile to a mile thick. And again, so we don't lose the point, that's up to 5,300 feet thick. The crust itself would have been 10 to 50 miles thick. So imagine in your mind this large supercontinent, smaller oceans, massive lush vegetation. Imagine this subterranean water chamber, call it a mile thick, 10 to 50 miles below the crust, and it is under immense pressure due to the overbearing rock layer, as we might imagine. Modeling tells us that over time, due to the tidal effects of the moon, energy would have slowly been building up in that water chamber. So the tidal effects that normally affect our ocean would just be pumping the land that's on top of the ocean, and energy would have slowly been building. This has been modeled in these subterranean water chambers. Failure in the crust possibly began because of a microscopic crack that was either initiated due to the intense pressure in the subterranean cavern that exceeded the shear strength of the overlaying granite, or simply initiated by God. This fracture formed in the subterranean cavern and traveled up through the crust to the surface. The fracture would have then begun to cut through rock as it ran in both directions, traveling around the globe to release the pressure in the water column that's below all this granite. Estimates indicate it would have traveled around the globe at the speed of sound in granite, which is about 2 miles per second. It would have circled the globe in probably less than 3 hours. The estimate power released on the face of this planet would have exceeded every nuclear explosion and every nuclear test ever conducted by a massive factor. The tear, initially small, would have allowed water under massive pressure to begin to escape uncontrollably. It would have been shearing pebbles and rocks as it raced through this crack. Meanwhile, the crust begins to pulse, injecting further pebbles and rocks as it's shearing them as this water is being ejected. So imagine water along with dirt, pebbles, and rocks ejected violently into our atmosphere. This water would have jetted, sprayed supersonically, not only into our atmosphere, but beyond our atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such that the earth has never experienced before or since. This would have been a catastrophe unlike anything you or I have ever imagined in our wildest nightmare. With water jetting into and above our atmosphere, rain that includes dirt and pebbles and rocks, and meanwhile the water begins to build on the face of this planet. And by the way, in the upper latitudes, the space shuttle has already taught us much of that would have rained back as ice and snow because of the cold temperatures in our upper atmosphere. If you had been standing on the surface of our planet, you would have beheld a catastrophe of epic proportion with torrential rain. As you move closer and closer to the rip itself, the volume of mud and pebbles and rocks raining down would have increased. This event would have created the majority of the fossils we find on our planet. This event would have created the oil, coal, and methane reserves we find on our planet through processes we can repeat in a lab today. This event would have created the rapid and catastrophic plate tectonics that created the surface we see today. This catastrophic event would have included massive volcanic activity, particularly in the Pacific Basin. The atmospheric turbulence would have been unmatched across this planet prior to anything that has happened that day and since. As the fountains of the great deep burst forth, you can imagine the heavy and atmospheric disturbances, the turbulence. This event would have resulted in thousands of woolly mammoths and rhinoceros being frozen with green, lush plants in their mouths in the northern latitudes. You see, it's when we begin to understand the cataclysm that was the global deluge that we have a number of questions that were once enigmas answered through processes that we can understand scientifically. Had you been standing on our moon, here's what I believe you would have seen. You would have seen the spray of the fountains of the great deep as they reflected the light of sun. Shortly following that, you would have seen massive volcanism, volcanic activity, and the sky would begin to blacken around our planet. A global cataclysm. It is no surprise that the Hebrew has one word and one word for this only. And it's only used to describe this flood. And anytime any other flood is used, it's a different Hebrew word. It's no surprise that the Greek has one word that describes this event. And anytime a local flood is used or described, as a totally different Greek word. This would have been a massive, globe-changing event. And we know when this event happened. It happened in the 600th year, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month. On that very day, the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Sandy.
I always thought that the second month was he was 600 years in the second month of Noah's life, starting his year, is what I always thought that was.
So I don't know what I said, but 600 year of Noah's life, second month, 17th day. Oh, but we hooked them all together to get year 1656. And if that generates a question, I'll let you know. This was Noah's life. In the 600 year of Noah's life. This is not from creation. This is Noah's life. Noah is exactly that age when this real event occurred. Now, I know some of you, I know it, I have no doubt. When I had that last picture up, you said, hey, Rich, that picture's cute, taken from the moon, but that's a bridge too far. You've got rocks being catapulted off our planet, some of them even going towards the moon. That is highly unlikely. I really doubt that to be true. Well, I do want to share something with you. This is a picture taken from the Apollo 14 mission, and I want to talk about rocks that came back from that mission. The date is February 5th, 1971. Apollo 14, headed by Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell, land on the moon, and during 2 spacewalks, they collect 94.35 pounds of rocks. So they're just out there picking up rocks. They're going to bring them back to Earth to be analyzed. Fair enough. It's there that they pick up what NASA, 48 years later, announces. Earth's oldest rock found on the moon. Specimen 142321, what NASA considers to be the oldest Earth rock ever found, is found on the moon. Now, the first thing you might ask yourself is they launched this mission in 1971. They've had this rock, by the way, this article was printed in 2019. They've had this rock for 48 years before they printed this article. Why did it take them 48 years to tell us about this Earth rock? I'll leave that to you to think about. There's the rock itself, so it's not real big. 2 centimeters is like 0.8 inches, so you can see it's a few inches by a few more inches. Specimen 142321. It's comprised of quartz, feldspar, and zircon. Here's NASA's quote on its chemical composition. Chemical analysis of the rock fragment shows it crystallized in terrestrial-like oxidized system at terrestrial temperatures rather than in the reducing in higher temperature conditions characteristic on the moon, close quote. Let me tell you what they just said. This rock was formed on Earth. It wasn't melted and chucked to the moon and there formed. It was formed on Earth and as a complete rock ended up on the moon. And we took 48 years to tell you about this, but we're certain of it. It formed on the Earth and ended up on the moon. Keep thinking. So Alan Shepard and Apollo 14 land on a random spot on the moon. He exits the spacecraft. He bends over. He collects some rocks. They bring them back. 48 years later, they go, oh, by the way, one of the rocks he picked up in the random sample from the random landing came from Earth. Just thought you should know. Keep thinking. How unlikely is it for an impact here on Earth to launch rocks into space? How hard would something need to hit the planet? We're not talking about water under pressure that's blowing. So we're not talking about shooting a rocket from the planet. We're talking about shooting a rocket so hard against the planet that it blows stuff off the planet onto the moon. And where's the impact crater that did that? And what would have happened when that happened? Now consider this. How unlikely is it that the spacecraft, which is just landing on a random spot that they picked for no particular reason that has anything to do with this, and Alan Shepard gets out, randomly picks up rocks across a 14 million square mile lunar surface, and one or more of them came from Earth? Keep thinking. Who predicted that? It's funny you should ask. In Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, he predicted that very event. Not that we would find them on the moon, but that the power was so extreme that it launched water and rocks and pebbles into space. Not only was he not surprised of an announcement that took 48 years to announce, his theory had predicted that very thing. Now, I was normally going to leave this alone, Dean, but I want to say two more things and I'm going to let you say it. This is the near side of the moon. This is the far side of the moon. It's called that way because the moon is in a tidal lock with Earth. As we rotate, it's turning, but it's turning at the same rate. We're causing it to turn because it's in a tidal lock. So it always has the same face facing us. Now, as you look at the near side of the moon, you'll see there's a lot of dark spots. You know what we call those dark spots? Seas, Marias. In fact, the most famous one is called the Sea of Tranquility. Thank you, Matt, the Sea of Tranquility. Now, you're wondering, or maybe Tim said, I didn't hear it because Trish just gave him a high five over there. Now, you may be wondering, okay, what are seas? There are actually areas on the moon that were impacted so hard, scientists tell us, that lava, melted materials oozed out of the moon's surface because it was hit so hard. Keep thinking. How is it possible that the side of the moon that faces us has all these Marias, and the side that's protecting us from all the debris in outer space so not as much hits us only has a couple small Marias? How is that possible? I would submit to you that the foundations, the fountains of the great deep being cleaved open answer why this looks like that. Now, if you ask NASA why this looks like that, they will tell you that this side was hit so hard that it created lava on that side. I didn't make that up, y'all. I wasn't even going to tell you. I was going to leave you to go figure that one out all by yourself. That's their view of what has happened here. Now, one other thing, and Dean, I'm going to go to you, but I want to show you one other thing. So in 2012, NASA launched the GRAIL mission. Now, GRAIL stood for Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory. Interesting. They wanted to look at the structure of the moon. A lot of different studies. This is a density pattern of the near side of the moon, and then they did a density pattern of the far side of the moon. It will not surprise you that the near side of the moon is much denser than the far side of the moon, having been pummeled by something. Now, if you're going to make this be pummeled by something that came from outer space, then you're going to need to explain how those rocks skirted around our planet to whack the side of the moon that faces us. And that's going to be quite a challenge, by the way, just dealing with the gravity of rocks skirting around the earth so they can hit the face of the moon that's facing us. What I want you to see is Noah's flood, and we're just pulling the string right now. Noah's flood is witnessed in almost every area of science when you fully understand them. Now, I said all that so that when I tell you that it was a global catastrophe, I want your sanctified imagination to put yourself on the ark and to hear the mud, to hear the pebbles, to hear the rain, and to understand it was indeed a global catastrophe of epic proportions, torrential rain. There was nothing like it before and nothing like it since. And Dean has a question.
My question was, the fellow who wrote the article about that, and then they came back 40-some years later
48.
and announced that rock is from Earth. Was the fellow who wrote that article still alive? Is he still alive?
Dr. Walt Brown is still alive. I don't know how well he's doing. He's an older gentleman.
But so he knows that.
He knows that.
Wow.
He's got other predictions about rocks in space. So if you want to go get his book and read those other predictions, and you'll find that they've been found true, although it took a long time. And Kristen has a question.
So
And then I'm going to get us back to our text.
just to clarify with what you just showed us, it would have had to have been some sort of supernatural power by God to protect the ark to begin with, because it would have been to keep it not only on Earth's surface, but to keep these geysers from blowing it up.
These geysers, as we're going to talk in coming weeks, shredded miles of granite. These created the mid-oceanic ridge through a process that we now understand. This event created the catastrophic plate tectonics, where plates slid away from each other under lubricating water, which we just talked about, the catastrophe that is the global flood. It was an epic catastrophe that changed everything about this planet.
And the answer is yes.
And the answer is yes. And Richie has a question, and then, Janice has a question, then Richie.
Did NASA give an explanation in that article from 2019 about how they thought Earth's rocks landed on the moon?
Yes, they did. They, again, they believed that the Earth was hit with something that catapulted that rock that he randomly found, and then they backed it up with just kind of a passing statement, well, the moon used to be closer, and so that would have allowed it to eject. Again, no evidence on where the ejection would have occurred. No explanation. What are the odds of this rock? If there's just a couple being found, there's more than a couple. The moon's littered with Earth rocks. That's what we would find if we got there and studied it. That's why I found one, because they're everywhere. They're all over the place. So whatever it is, it was a catastrophe that happened on Earth. And I would argue that we see the signs of it in Noah's flood, and we'll talk more about those. But Martha has a question, I think. Oh, no, Martha does not have a question. Richie has a question.
So, just for clarity, the plates and like when you see the shelf in the ocean and stuff, that is the actual crack. In my mind, I'm seeing a crack that goes and rotates, goes all the way around the Earth, and it's not just this scattered up map look. It is more of a defined line that goes around. Thank you.
How many have ever seen and by the way, next week, be here. You will see a picture of the mid-oceanic ridge. I will bring it to you. I will show you the map, mapped by our Navy. We are certain. Has anyone ever seen a picture of the mid-oceanic ridge? I know my wife has. She sees all. No, the mid-oceanic ridge. It is what science says is the conveyor belt for plate tectonics. Science says that it's the mid-oceanic ridge that pushes up ever so slowly, 2 inches a year, like a fingernail grows, and pushes out the continents away from each other. We'll look at it next week. More evidence of exactly what happened. And what you see in the Atlantic, the mid-oceanic ridge, you see is a massive trench in the Pacific. And the ring of fire, if you're familiar with that. As that plate subducted. But we'll talk more about that in coming weeks. We're getting way off, but I know I'm causing you to think, and I love that. But I want to get us back to Genesis.
So we've got this ice
Going around.
which would have been immediately destroyed.
Exactly.
Can
And
you?
that's what I was going to say. So that's gone.
If it existed, Deb, the moment the fountains of the great deep cracked open, it began to be shattered and destroyed. And it, whatever it was, water, ice, water vapor, whatever you want it to be, it is raining down. If it's water, it's just joining the water that's coming back to earth. That's going to become part of what's going to cover this planet. By the way, the highest mountain, 15 cubits. If we convert that to feet, 25.5 feet. I hope in your mind so far, again, we're not done talking about it, I'm just introducing, because we just introduced it. But I hope you're beginning to picture something more horrific than you've ever imagined. Don't picture a little Noah's Ark with happy animals out on the deck smiling. We're going to bob around for a little bit. Picture a global catastrophe that is shredding granite and jettisoning it supersonically, not only into our atmosphere, but beyond. It is torrential rain. It is activity, both seismic, geographic, atmospheric, of unmeasured proportion. Let's get back to the text. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm doing good. That was the introduction. Okay, that was not the introduction. That was the first part of verse 1. And by the way, I apologize for that much, but I had to weave it in here today. I want you to start seeing things that you must see. So we see it's the 600 year of Noah's life. It's the second month, it's the 17th day of the month. We talked about the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. Here it is, Deb, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, some theologians believe that's code for, and the canopy is destroyed. Other theologians believe, no, that's code for what Noah saw as they peered out their little 20.4-inch window that wrapped around the top of the ark. They saw what looked like the windows of heaven being opened. Rich would say, yes. If there was a canopy, it's included there, but what they saw would have looked like that. By the way, Holman describes it this way: the floodgates of the skies were opened. The Message describes it this way: the windows of heaven were thrown open. Verse 12, and the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, when we read that, we've probably pictured, it's a hard rain like we get here in Florida, and it just lasted a while. No. This is a torrential rain that's being driven by the fountains of the great deep. This is catastrophic. Meanwhile, as the water's building on the earth, you still have all the tidal effects happening from the moon. Except now those tidal effects are planet-wide. The water's just not rising, the water's sweeping around this planet. Imagine a catastrophe that's much larger than anything you've imagined. Now, at some point, the stuff is going to stop jettisoning into the atmosphere. At some point, it's just going to start rising the water level, and that's all that will be happening. But imagine the mud, the silt, the rocks, and the pebbles that are all part of this fallout that are burying millions of fossils, millions of living animals of all forms alive like that. That's why we have fossilized fish eating another fish, caught in the very act of fish eating. We have a fossilized fish birthing fish, caught in the very act, that quick, died instantly as they were buried. We have anemones and soft-sided things buried instantly and preserved, all because of the global catastrophe that is Noah's flood. Verse 13. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wives, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. We were told that. It's just reiterating. And here's why. There's safety nowhere else but the ark. If you are not in the ark, you will not be preserved. And that's why that's why this is being repeated, more than likely, by Moses.
It's a reminder to me, how we all sometimes complain about God's timing. Why did they go in on that day? You know what I mean? It's
because on that day,
I know, but it was already rain. It was already coming down. It says, no, and the rain fell upon the earth, and on the very same day. And it's like, why at the very last second do they all go in the ark?
He shuts them. So they went on the ark a week early, if you remember the story. and then God sent the animals to them. So they were loading the animals, and then God shut the door. Methuselah probably that last week died. You can imagine they had a watch on Methuselah. When he dies, it comes. Like, how's Methuselah doing? He's looking a little rough. Get on the ark. But again, God had told them to get on the ark. That God had sent the animals. No, it's saying on that day it began to rain. Yeah, it's just a reiteration of a point they already told us. Verse 14, a point they've already told us, but it's going to reiterate. They, that's the 8, and every beast according to its kind, all the livestock according to their kinds, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, every bird according to its kind, every winged creature, obviously according to its kind, are on the ark, and chaos hits. Now it's here, and let's be honest, we hit many objections on the flood, but here's one of them. And we talked about it briefly last week, but let's hit it now. There's no way Noah loaded 2 of all of those animals. He didn't load 2 of all of those animals. There's no way Noah loaded 2 of all of the species of animals. He didn't load 2 of the species of all the animals. He loaded 2 of every kind of animal. Now, we don't have a clear distinction of kinds, but it's sort of obvious what the kinds are. The dog kind. The current estimate for dog species on Earth is between 200 and 500, depending on who you read behind. Noah did not load 1,000 dogs on the ark. He loaded 2 that had all the genetic variability that we see in the dog kind. And by the way, this is not Rich's idea. Modern science tells us that all the dogs we see today descended from 2 dogs, likely gray wolves. He loaded something that was like a gray wolf on the ark, a dog kind that had all the genetic variability of the 500 species we see, up to 500 we see today. Or if we were to look at cats, the current estimate for cat species is 100. He did not load 200 cats on the ark. As modern science tells us, all the current cats we see on our planet likely came from one cat pair. He loaded a cat that had all the genetic variability of the cat species, the feline species, we see on our planet. So rather than up to this point, what would that be, 1,200 animals, he loaded 4. And God loaded them, and that's a good point that's about to come around again because Bill made mention of it last week. So, 2 dogs, 2 cats. Now at the Ark encounter, just to remind you, they estimated that Noah would have had to deal with 1,398 kinds of animals. That's their estimate of their research. So if you want to hold that in your mind, just round it up to 1,400. Makes it easier to remember. So as best modern science, biblical science, creation science would say, 1,400 animal kinds. If you account for 14 clean and 2 unclean, if you break them apart, they come up with 6,744 animals being loaded on the ark. So we'll round that up and just say 6,800 animals. Now, if you go back, last week I told you that the ark was 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, 51 feet tall, with a carrying capacity of 2.2 million volumetric feet. 3 decks. The capacity would have been to carry 183,000 sheep-sized creatures. They carried less than 7,000. There was lots of room. The cages weren't stacked on each other. There was room for food. There was room for people. There was room for people to respond to Noah's preaching. But let's get back to the text. There's things that are not listed. There's no sea life listed. The sea life is going to fend for its own in the oceans. Bugs, beetles, gnats, and flies, probably not on board the ark. They could have been in the creeping things, but not likely because they don't have the breath of life. Could they have been? Absolutely. But probably bugs, beetles, gnats, and flies, that's its own category that's going to survive through this thing, eating on rotten carcasses and floating trees and etc. But the ark is the place where God will protect 8 humans and all the animals. The ark is the place where God will safely fulfill his promise to deliver these people from his destruction. The ark is the picture of salvation. The ark saved Noah and his family from God's temporal judgment. And there's only one ark left that will save mankind from God's coming judgment. And that's the Lord Jesus Christ. The ark is a picture of an ultimate and final destruction. And there's only one way to escape that destruction. And it's by faith in God's Son and what he did. It's to respond. They had to respond to Noah's message. We have to respond to a message as well by faith. Just one thing, we've got a few more minutes before they're going to weigh me down. Think about this, 2 points if you've never considered them. The ark was afloat for a little over a year. Nothing died. We have no record of anything dying. It isn't like they got off and said, well, looks like there's not going to be any felines in the new world. One of the cats died. But there's something else that never happened. It didn't happen either. Nothing was born. They didn't exit the ark and go, whoa, we made it off just in time. We've got 7,518 rabbits. A lot of rabbit kind of. Nothing died and nothing multiplied. Verse 15. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. We talked about that. Bill, after class, if you remember last week, we were talking about, well, how would Noah know what was clean and unclean? And we speculated, well, maybe he knew, maybe he didn't know. Well, and Bill said, well, because God was bringing the animals, he didn't need to know. Here's what he determined. Oh, I guess that's a clean one. 14 parade by. The little pig comes in. I guess that's an unclean one. So maybe he didn't need to know too much, except that God was going to deliver the animals to him by the right number. And Bill, thank you for that. Verse 16, of those that entered the ark, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and God shut the door. God tucked them in. God sealed the door. And guess what happened that moment? The chance to respond to Noah's preaching by faith and board the ark ended. That very moment. When the rain began to pour, I bet a lot of people said, maybe this is true. When the rain got up to their knees, or they were dodging boulders from the catastrophe that was the flood, I bet many more believed it was too late. There will come a day when the chance to respond to God's message of grace will end. The ark door will close, and it will be too late. And Dean has a question.
So
We're wrapping up here.
I've heard you mention this a couple of times, and I don't know. It's new to me. So where do you get that Noah preached to people to get on the ark?
Peter calls him righteous Noah. It has this idea that he's declaring to the world what God is going to do.
Yeah, but didn't he know there was no room for anybody but him?
Hey, Dean, just
No, there was lots of room. There was lots of room. That's the whole point. It could carry up to 183,000 sheep-sized creatures. It had less than 7,000. It had food. It had water. It had room for lots of people to respond. Are you ready for this reality? The message of grace today has room for everyone to respond. No one gets to say, well, I thought the ark was full. I didn't know there was room. I would have jumped on board. And God, holding true to his offer, provided plenty of room for anyone who wanted to respond. And that time was open all the way until the Lord tucked them in and shut the door. And the day of grace ended. You know what else ended that day? You know that Noah, he's a crazy old bugger. Ain't gonna be no flood. If there was a canopy, it's never rained around here. He's crazy. All the debate, all the discussion, everything, all that ended the moment that door shut. And now processes were set in place that were irreversible, and where your choice had landed you up to that minute is where eternity was going to find you. And there's no greater truth than that reality right there for us today. The choice we make in the moment, this moment, could be the last time we have a choice. A picture of God's coming destruction, but a more beautiful picture of God's deliverance in the person of Christ, of His perfect preservation in the person of Christ. None will be lost. None will be missed. None will be misplaced. It is a beautiful reminder of what Christ has done for us. But don't lose the thread, and we'll pick it back up. It was a real, legitimate, global catastrophe that happened at a point in time, the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of his life. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. So we'll leave here as the Lord shuts Noah in, and Lord willing, we'll pick back up in verse 16. So the good news is the early morning class won't have as many verses to catch up. Let's pray.